"You really think you've won?" he sneered, trying to mask his panic with arrogance. "You're done, Holden," she said. "There's nowhere left to run." His jaw tightened. He knew she was right, but he wasn't going down without a fight. In a blur of motion, Holden's hand flew to his waistband. Alina saw the gun before it was fully drawn. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the packed Ridgeport courtroom. The air was thick with the quiet murmurs of attorneys shuffling their papers, the dull scratch of pens against legal pads, and the occasional cough breaking the monotony. It was a typical day in court, a system that churned through cases like a well-oiled machine, ensuring that justice, or something resembling it, was served. Standing at the center of it all was Police Chief Mark Holden. He had been in law enforcement for nearly 20 years, clawing his way up the ranks not through merit but through fear, coercion, and the quiet backing of those who benefited from his unchecked power. He was Ridgeport's enforcer, the man officers looked to when they needed a cover-up, a loophole, or simply someone to take the fall. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been held accountable for his actions. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the court's artificial lighting. Today was no different from any other day, or so he thought. The defendant sat hunched over at the table, Jared Willis, a young black man accused of resisting arrest. The reality, of course, was far more sinister. Jared had been stopped by Holden's men for looking suspicious, which in Ridgeport was often a thinly veiled excuse for racial profiling. When Jared had demanded to know why he was being detained, he was thrown to the ground, cuffed and beaten until he stopped resisting, a phrase officers like Holden often used to justify excessive force. Holden took the stand, his voice smooth and practiced as he gave his testimony. He had done this hundreds of times before. The judge, a man who had presided over Holden's cases for years, nodded along, occasionally glancing at the defense attorney as if to say, "This is pointless. Just let it go." At the back of the courtroom, a woman entered quietly, her presence unnoticed at first. She wore a sleek, tailored black suit, her heels barely making a sound against the polished wooden floor. She took a seat in the gallery, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her dark eyes locked onto Holden as he continued speaking, the smirk on his lips widening as he embellished his version of events. Holden noticed her. He had a knack for spotting outsiders, people who didn't belong in the tightly controlled environment he operated in. He took in her composed demeanor, the way she stared at him without fear, and instantly he didn't like her. As soon as Holden was dismissed from the stand, he made his way toward the gallery, his boots clicking against the floor with purpose. He leaned against the railing, his voice laced with mocking authority. "Something I can help you with, ma'am?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The woman remained unmoved. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Holden's smirk widened. Another relative hoping to see a miracle, no doubt. Another black woman thinking the system would suddenly work in their favor. He had seen it before, and it always ended the same way. "You lost," he sneered. "This ain't the welfare office." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge's gavel froze midair, his eyes widening at the blatant disrespect. Even the defense attorney, who had likely resigned himself to losing yet another case, stiffened. The woman rose to her feet, her movements precise, deliberate. Holden watched her, a flicker of something, annoyance, discomfort, crossing his face as she stepped closer. "Sit down, lady," he barked, taking a step forward, his stance imposing. "This isn't your business." The woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Excuse me," Holden scoffed. He loved moments like this when he could remind people exactly who was in charge. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "I said, remove your hand." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something unshakable. Holden tightened his grip, feeling the familiar surge of power that came with these encounters. Or what? He spat, giving her a slight shove. Humiliation. Fear. That's what usually came next, but not this time. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her jacket. Holden's instincts kicked in. His muscles tensed as he prepared for the worst. He had drawn his gun for less before. The room collectively held its breath. Then she pulled out a badge. The courtroom turned to ice. Holden's smug grin vanished, his fingers loosening from her arm as he staggered back a step. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights, but it wasn't just any badge. It was his badge in a way. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady, unyielding. "I am Chief Elena Price, the new police chief of Ridgeport." Silence. Pure, deafening silence. Holden froze, his jaw slack. His mind scrambled to process what had just happened. This wasn't possible. The whispers began, hushed but urgent. The defense attorney blinked as if he were seeing a ghost. The judge's gavel finally came down, but the room had already descended into chaos. Holden's face turned pale, his heart hammering in his chest. He had just manhandled the new police chief. The realization hit him like a freight train. This woman, this black woman, was his superior. He had spent years bullying, intimidating, and controlling people like her, believing himself to be untouchable. But now, everything had changed. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Holden's hands twitched at his sides. His power, his authority, it all suddenly felt fragile. Then, just as quickly as the moment arrived, Elena turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like a private discussion regarding Officer Holden's conduct, not just today but throughout his career." The judge hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and Holden. For the first time in his career, Holden felt trapped. "Very well," the judge finally said, his voice uncertain. The session was abruptly recessed. The gallery erupted in murmurs and speculation, people exchanging wide-eyed glances. Holden could feel it now, the shifting tide, the undeniable realization settling over the courtroom. The world as he knew it had just changed forever. The rain fell in steady sheets outside, casting long, fractured reflections of the Ridgeport Police Department's towering headquarters onto the slick pavement. Inside her office, Chief Elena Price sat with her fingers interlaced, her gaze fixed on the thick case file in front of her. The name on the cover, Terrence Reid, stared back at her, as if daring her to unearth what had long been buried. This wasn't just another case. It was a battle for the very soul of the department, a confrontation with a system that had shielded men like Mark Holden for years. She had grown up knowing what it felt like to be on the wrong side of power. As a child in East Ridge, she had watched the police terrorize her neighborhood, treating every black boy like a suspect and every black man like a criminal. But the defining moment of her life came on a warm August evening when she was 16 years old. Her brother, David, had just left a corner store, a bag of groceries in his hand. A patrol car screeched to a stop beside him, red and blue lights flashing in the fading sunlight. Elena had been across the street and saw the panic in David's eyes before the officers even stepped out. "Keep your hands where we can see them," one of them barked. David complied. It didn't matter. In seconds, he was slammed against the hood of the squad car, his face pressed to the scorching metal. An officer gripped his wrist, twisted it back, and threw him onto the ground. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't even spoken. But to the police, he fit the description. David spent 3 days in holding before they finally released him, with no charges, no apology, nothing. Elena had stood outside the precinct, watching her brother walk out with bruises on his face and fire in his eyes. "You can't bet them," he had muttered. "The system's too big." But even then, she had refused to believe that, and now, years later, she was going to prove him wrong. Alina flipped through the pages of Terrence Reed's file, searching for the cracks in the official story. According to Holden's report, Terrence had been pulled over for a broken taillight. The stop escalated when officers supposedly found a bag of cocaine in his glove compartment. He had resisted arrest and attempted to flee the scene, forcing officers to subdue him with force. That was Holden's version. But Alina knew how men like him operated. She scanned the testimonies. Inconsistencies jumped out at her immediately. The arresting officer's reports didn't match. No body cam footage was ever submitted. The drugs had never been tested for fingerprints. This wasn't sloppy police work. This was deliberate. Terrence Reed had been set up, and if she wanted to take Holden down, she needed proof. Before she could make her next move, Holden made his. By morning, the media had already turned against her. Political witch hunt, police chief targeting decorated officer. Holden speaks out, they're trying to destroy my career. Holden was playing the victim, painting Alina as a ruthless outsider waging war on the department for personal gain. On camera, he sat perfectly composed, his uniform pressed, his expression a mask of disbelief and righteous anger. I've given my life to this city. I've put criminals behind bars, protected our streets, and now they're treating me like the bad guy because of politics. The reporters nodded along, feeding his narrative. The story spread like wildfire. And just like that, Holden had flipped the script. Alina wasn't going to let him control the story. She needed a witness. Someone who had been there when Terrence was arrested. Someone who had seen Holden's tactics firsthand. So she tracked down Officer James Calloway, a former Ridgeport officer who had left the force 2 years after Terrence's arrest. When she called him, there was hesitation on the line. I can't talk about this, Chief. You were there that night, Alina pressed. You saw what happened. A long silence. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. You have no idea what you're stepping into. I know Holden planted evidence, she said. I need you to confirm it. Another pause. Then I saw it, he admitted. Terrence never resisted. Holden set the whole thing up. Alina's grip tightened around her phone. She had what she needed, but she also knew Holden wasn't going to go down without a fight. That night, Alina sat in her office, watching the city lights flicker through her window. She had been in this fight before. But this time, she wasn't just fighting Holden. She was fighting a system that had protected him for years. She was fighting against an entire machine designed to keep men like him untouchable. And if she wanted to win, she had to be ready to go all the way. Because Holden thought this was a battle for his career. But Alina knew the truth. This wasn't about his career. It was about justice. And she wasn't backing down. The night was quiet in Ridgeport, but inside the walls of the police department, war was being waged in silence. Alina Price sat in her office, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting sharp shadows across the open case files, reports, and old arrest records spread before her. She had spent the last 3 nights barely sleeping, poring over every case linked to Mark Holden, searching for the single thread that could unravel his entire legacy of corruption. And now she had found it. Buried deep in an old evidence log, Alina found something odd. A storage unit listed under the Ridgeport Police Department's jurisdiction, one that had been signed off by Holden years ago. It wasn't standard police storage. This wasn't where they kept logged weapons, drugs, or case materials. This was something Holden had personally locked away. Her gut twisted. If there was something there, it was damning. And she needed to see it before he realized she was looking. She couldn't trust anyone else. That night, Alina drove across the city in an unmarked car, pulling into a rundown storage facility just off Crestwood Avenue, far from police headquarters. She stepped out, rain pattering against her coat as she approached Unit 413. She inserted the department override key, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she was about to uncover. The lock clicked. She pulled the door open, and felt her breath catch in her throat. Inside, shelves stacked with dozens of old case files, evidence boxes, and, most chillingly, an entire section dedicated to VHS tapes and USB drives. Alina grabbed one marked Reed T. 2016 and plugged the USB into her laptop. As the screen flickered to life, the truth she had been chasing finally came into view. The footage was grainy, taken from a body cam that had never been logged into evidence. The timestamp read March 8, 2016, the night Terrence Reed had been arrested. Alina's stomach twisted as the screen showed Holden approaching Reed's car, his face cold and calculated. "Let's make this easy," Holden's voice crackled through the speaker. "Step out of the car." Reed complied. No resistance, no aggression, just confusion. "What's going on?" Reed asked, his hands raised. Then Holden turned to the nearest officer. "Do it," he ordered. Another officer walked past Holden's body cam, holding a small bag of cocaine. He leaned into Reed's car, placed it in the glove compartment, and stepped back. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," Holden announced, shoving Reed against the hood of the car. Reed's voice was panicked. "That's not mine. That wasn't in my car," Holden smirked. "Then how did it get there?" The screen glitched for a second, and when it returned, everything changed. Terrence Reed was on the ground. Holden had his knee pressed to the back of his neck, pinning him down. "I can't breathe," Reed gasped. Holden didn't move. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you ran your mouth," Holden muttered. Then he pressed down harder. The wheezing stopped. Alina's hand clenched into a fist as she watched Holden slowly stand up, adjust his uniform, and glance around. "Call it in," Holden told the other officer, his tone unbothered, indifferent. "Make sure the report matches the story." The video cut out, and Alina sat in absolute silence, her hands shaking. This wasn't just evidence planting. This was murder. The next morning, Alina walked into Internal Affairs, a USB drive in her pocket. By noon, the footage had been leaked. By 1 p.m., it was playing on every major news station. The city of Ridgeport exploded. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, demanding Holden's immediate arrest. Social media was flooded with calls for justice, the hashtag Justice for Reed trending nationally. And for the first time, Holden's allies started abandoning him. The police union refused to comment. The mayor distanced himself, releasing a vague statement about a full investigation. And at 4 p.m., the governor of the state made a surprise announcement. Effective immediately, Chief Mark Holden is placed on administrative leave pending a full criminal investigation. It was the first crack in his armor of invincibility. But Alina wasn't done yet. Inside his home, Holden paced, his face pale as the news played on his TV. Every phone call he made was ignored. Every ally he reached out to refused to answer. He had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. And now he was alone, but Holden wasn't the type to go down without a fight. As he stared at the screen at Alina Price's face in a press conference outside the courthouse, his fingers curled into a fist. "You think you've won, Price," he muttered. Then he picked up his phone. "Get me something on her. Anything. I don't care what it takes." Holden was going to fight back, and he wasn't afraid to play dirty. The city of Ridgeport was on edge. The streets pulsed with outrage and anticipation, the air thick with the tension of a city waiting for justice to be served. Mark Holden, once the untouchable enforcer of Ridgeport's corrupt law, was now the most wanted man in the state. But he wasn't going to wait around to be arrested. He was going to run. Inside an abandoned warehouse near the city's industrial district, Mark Holden sat alone, gripping his phone tightly. The news anchors had been repeating the same words over and over. "Former Chief Mark Holden, wanted for murder, remains at large." The words made his skin crawl. He had been the hunter for so long. Now he was the prey. The police department he had once controlled had turned against him. The governor had publicly condemned him. The men he had protected for years were refusing to answer his calls. He was out of options. Holden exhaled slowly, pulling a disposable phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a number. After a few rings, a voice answered. Cold, professional. You need to move now. The police are locking down the city. Holden gritted his teeth. What's my way out? Private airstrip outside Crestwood. Be there in 2 hours. Cash only. The line went dead. Holden slid the phone into his pocket and stood up, his heart pounding. It was time to disappear. At Ridgeport PD, Chief Alina Price stood over a large map, her eyes scanning the possible escape routes Holden could take. She knew how men like him thought. They didn't believe they could be beaten. Even now, Holden would be convinced that he could outmaneuver her, slip away before justice caught up to him. But she knew better. If you were him, where would you run? She muttered to herself. Her gaze landed on Crestwood Airstrip. It was small, privately owned, with no commercial flights, perfect for a discreet getaway. A knowing smirk tugged at her lips. Got you. She grabbed her phone. Mobilize a team, we're moving now. The sky was pitch black, the cold night air biting against Alina's skin as she and her officers moved into position around the airstrip. The runway lights were dim, the hum of a private jet engine warming up in the distance. She crouched behind a cargo truck, her eyes trained on the entrance. He's coming, an officer whispered over the radio. She saw it a moment later, a black SUV tearing down the dirt road, dust billowing behind it as it sped toward the jet. Hold positions, Alina ordered. The SUV skidded to a halt near the plane. Holden jumped out, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face tense. He moved quickly, his head on a swivel, knowing time was against him. Alina stepped forward, raising her gun. Holden, don't move. The moment he heard her voice, his body stiffened. Slowly, he turned to face her. For the first time in his life, Mark Holden looked afraid. Holden's eyes darted toward the plane, then back to Alina. You really think you've won? He sneered, trying to mask his panic with arrogance. You're done, Holden, she said. There's nowhere left to run. His jaw tightened. He knew she was right, but he wasn't going down without a fight. In a blur of motion, Holden's hand flew to his waistband. Alina saw the gun before it was fully drawn. Bang! A single shot rang out. Holden stumbled back, a sharp cry of pain escaping his lips as he collapsed onto one knee. Blood bloomed across his pant leg, a clean shot to his thigh. His gun clattered to the ground, his fingers twitching as he tried to reach for it. Don't, Alina warned, stepping closer, her weapon still raised. Holden gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up at her, his once cocky, untouchable demeanor shattered. You think this changes anything? He spat. Alina crouched slightly, leveling her gaze with his. No, Holden, she said evenly. But it's a damn good start. Behind her, officers rushed in, guns drawn. Take him into custody, Alina ordered. They moved in, pinning Holden to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back as he groaned in pain. For years, he had been the one putting cuffs on innocent men. Now it was his turn. As they dragged him toward the waiting police vehicle, Holden twisted his head to look at Alina one last time. There was rage in his eyes, but beneath it, fear. For the first time in his life, he had no power, no protection, no way out. Alina stood tall, holstering her weapon. As she watched them drive away, the weight of everything settled in. The fight wasn't over, but tonight justice had won, and that was enough. For now. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists crammed into the back rows, their cameras ready to capture the final moments of Mark Holden's downfall. The city of Ridgeport had waited for this day, for justice, for reckoning, for closure. At the center of it all sat Mark Holden, his hands cuffed, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the pristine, tailored suits he once wore. His face was unreadable, but Alina Price knew the truth. For the first time in his life, Holden had lost. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and turned his gaze toward Holden. Mark Holden, this court finds you guilty of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and second-degree murder of Terrence Reed. A murmur rippled through the room, the words sinking into every ear, every heart, every mind. You spent years abusing your power, believing yourself to be untouchable. You manipulated the law, silenced your victims, and destroyed lives with no remorse. Today, that ends. Holden's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom. You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The entire room erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. On one side, supporters of Terrence Reed's family hugged each other, their tears a mix of grief and vindication. On the other, a handful of Holden's dwindling allies sat in stunned silence, knowing that if Holden could fall, so could they. But Alina, she simply watched as Holden was pulled to his feet, shackled, and led toward the exit. He didn't fight, didn't turn around, but as he passed her, he muttered under his breath, his voice like gravel. "You think this ends with me?" Alina met his eyes, her stare cold, unyielding. "I know it doesn't." And just like that, he was gone. Holden's fall set off a chain reaction throughout Ridgeport's law enforcement. Within days, the investigation into his crimes expanded, revealing a web of corruption that stretched further than anyone had imagined. Over a dozen officers were fired or resigned in disgrace. 2 high-ranking officials were arrested for aiding in cover-ups. Old cases were reopened, and for the first time, victims saw the possibility of justice. For Ridgeport, this was a turning point. For Alina Price, this was just the beginning. Alina had spent weeks wrapped in the fight to bring Holden down. But now, standing on the steps of the courthouse, she finally breathed. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in her direction. "Chief Price, what does this verdict mean for Ridgeport? Do you believe this will restore trust in the police department? How does it feel to bring down Mark Holden?" She looked past them to the people gathered behind the cameras, the families, the activists, the survivors of police brutality. She knew what they wanted to hear. She could have said it felt good, that this was a victory, that Ridgeport could finally heal. But she didn't. Instead, she leveled her gaze at the cameras. "This was never about bringing down one man," she said firmly. "It was about holding a system accountable, and we are far from finished." That night, as she sat in her office, the weight of everything finally settling in, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She stared at the screen before finally opening the message. Mark was just the first. There are many more. A slow, cold realization spread through her. This wasn't over, not even close. Holden was a symptom of a larger disease, and somewhere in the shadows of Ridgeport, others were waiting, watching, and preparing to fight back. Alina exhaled, setting the phone down. She had won this battle, but the war for justice, that was just beginning. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the next storm brewing beneath the surface. But inside Ridgeport PD, Chief Alina Price prepared for the next fight. Because justice was never just a single victory. It was a war that had to be fought every single day, and she was ready. The downfall of Mark Holden was not just about bringing one corrupt officer to justice. It was about exposing the deep-rooted flaws in a system that had protected him for years. The case of Terrence Reed was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. Alina Price's journey reminds us that true justice is never about a single victory. It's about changing the structures that allow injustice to thrive. Her fight didn't end with Holden's arrest. It unraveled a web of corruption, proving that those in power must be held accountable, no matter their rank or influence. The key lesson here is vigilance. Corruption does not disappear overnight. It adapts, finds new faces and new ways to survive. Holden's last words were a warning. There are many more like him, hidden behind badges, titles, and legal protections. Justice requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand against powerful forces, even when the odds seem impossible. Alina's story is a reminder that change is possible, but only if people are willing to fight for it every day. Because justice isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention, reform, and ensuring that history doesn't repeat itself.